On the morning of June 2nd, 1943, a train rolled into the small town of Aliceville, Alabama. The population of Aliceville was roughly 2,000 people. By nightfall, that number would nearly triple. Armed soldiers lined both sides of the highway stretching from the railroad station to a newly constructed camp 4 miles outside of town. They carried rifles, machine guns, shotguns, and pistols. It was the greatest show of armed force most of the townspeople had ever witnessed. Local residents gathered along the streets to watch what was coming. Farmers left their fields. Shop owners closed their doors. Children climbed onto their fathers' shoulders for a better view. The train doors opened. Out stepped hundreds of sun-tanned young men in faded uniforms. They were soldiers of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps, captured just 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia, after one of the most decisive Allied victories of the war. These were elite desert fighters who had pushed the British across North Africa. They had believed in German victory. Many still did. But something strange happened as these men marched in formation toward the camp. They were not looking at the armed guards. They were staring at the houses, at the cars parked in driveways, at the store windows filled with goods, at the children riding bicycles and the women hanging laundry in their yards. Guards later reported overhearing prisoners muttering to each other in disbelief. How is this possible? What these prisoners would witness over the following weeks, months, and years would shatter everything they believed about America. They had been told the United States was weak, decadent, incapable of sustaining a real war. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as soft, divided, and industrially inferior. The German High Command had assured them that American factories could never match German production, that American workers lacked discipline, that the vast distances of the Atlantic Ocean made meaningful American intervention impossible. Standing in that Alabama town, watching ordinary American life continue without any visible sign of strain or sacrifice, these hardened combat veterans began to understand a terrible truth. Germany had never had a chance. The story of German prisoners of war in America during World War II is one of the most remarkable and least remembered chapters of the conflict. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 425,000 German soldiers were transported across the Atlantic Ocean and held in camps scattered across 45 of the 48 American states. They came expecting brutality. What they found instead was abundance beyond anything they could have imagined, and that abundance told them everything they needed to know about who was going to win the war. To understand what these prisoners witnessed, you first have to understand where they came from. You have to understand the world they left behind and the lies they had been told about the world they were entering. The men of the Afrika Korps had been fighting in the North African desert since 1941. The Corps had been formed in January of that year under the command of General Erwin Rommel, who would become one of the most legendary commanders of the entire war. Hitler had sent them to shore up the collapsing Italian position in Libya after the British had routed Mussolini's forces in Operation Compass. From the beginning, the Afrika Korps was different from other German units. The Desert War had a strange character, sometimes called the War Without Hate. The vast empty spaces, the absence of civilians, the shared misery of heat and sand and thirst created a peculiar mutual respect between the opposing armies. Prisoners were generally treated decently by both sides. The rules of civilized warfare were more often observed than broken. But make no mistake, these were committed soldiers fighting for Nazi Germany. Many were true believers in the cause. Almost all of their officers were dedicated National Socialists who expected final victory. They had endured sandstorms that scoured the paint off vehicles. They had rationed water so strictly that some went days without washing. They had watched their supply lines stretch thinner and thinner as British naval forces interdicted convoys crossing the Mediterranean. By the final months of the campaign, many German units were surviving on captured British rations because their own supplies had simply stopped arriving. These were not soft men. They had been hardened by years of combat against the British Eighth Army, by the brutal conditions of desert warfare, by the constant threat of death from enemy fire or simple dehydration. They had followed Rommel across thousands of miles of wasteland. They believed in the cause. They believed in their commanders. They believed Germany would prevail. Then came the American landings in November of 1942. Operation Torch put over 100,000 Allied troops on the shores of Morocco and Algeria, catching the Axis forces in a massive pincer movement. Suddenly the Afrika Korps was fighting on two fronts, squeezed between Montgomery's forces advancing from the east and the Americans pushing from the west. The end came in May of 1943. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced Rommel when the Desert Fox was recalled to Germany, surrendered with over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. It was one of the largest mass capitulations of the war. The prisoners were marched to temporary holding camps in Tunisia and Algeria. Conditions were harsh, food was scarce, water was rationed. Men who had spent years fighting in the desert now sat behind barbed wire wondering what would happen to them next. Britain was already holding hundreds of thousands of German and Italian POWs and had no room for more. Canada agreed to take more than 30,000. The United States, initially reluctant to bring enemy soldiers onto American soil, eventually accepted the reality that there was simply nowhere else to put them. The first wave of prisoners was loaded onto American cargo ships at the ports of Oran and Casablanca. These were Liberty ships, the workhorses of the Allied supply chain, returning to America after delivering war materials to the European theatre. The holds that had carried tanks and ammunition now carried defeated soldiers. The German prisoners expected the worst. They'd heard stories about what happened to prisoners of war. Many had seen how German forces treated captured Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front, where millions died from starvation, exposure, and execution. They had been told that the Americans would be no different. That capture meant torture. That surrender meant death, just slower. Instead, they received their first shock before the ship even left port: the food. At 2 a.m. on the first night aboard, the prisoners sat down to their first substantial meal in months. Some had been subsisting on minimal rations during the final desperate weeks of the African campaign. Others had gone days in the holding camps with nothing but bread and water. Now they were presented with portions of meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Real coffee. Some prisoners thought it was a trick, an edible form of propaganda that would end as soon as the ship reached open water. They ate cautiously, waiting for the deception to reveal itself. It never did. The meals continued throughout the Atlantic crossing, breakfast, lunch, dinner, every day. The prisoners ate better as captives of the Americans than they had eaten as soldiers of the Wehrmacht. This pattern would continue for the duration of their imprisonment. The sea voyage lasted approximately 2 weeks. The prisoners had time to think about what awaited them. Many expected labor camps, others feared execution, some held on to hope that Germany would win the war quickly and they would be liberated before reaching American shores. The ships docked at ports along the American East Coast, primarily in New York, New Jersey, and Virginia. At the processing centers, the prisoners were deloused, given medical examinations, issued new clothing, and assigned to camps across the country. The efficiency was startling. The Americans seemed to have systems for everything, procedures for every contingency, forms for every piece of information. Then came the trains. The German soldiers expected to be transported in cattle cars. That was how prisoners were moved in Europe, packed standing in wooden boxcars with no food, no water, and no sanitation. The infamous 40-and-8 cars, designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses, had been used to transport prisoners across occupied Europe in conditions that killed thousands. Men died standing up in those cars, held upright by the crush of bodies around them. The Americans put them in Pullman cars. These were passenger coaches with upholstered seats, windows that opened, and regular meal service. The prisoners could not believe it. There had to be a mistake. Surely these comfortable coaches were meant for someone else. Surely the cattle cars were coming. They sat in comfortable seats and watched the American landscape roll past the windows, and what they saw changed them. The trains travelled for days, 1,000 miles, sometimes 2,000 miles, from the East Coast to camps in Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and beyond. Most of the camps were at least 1,000 miles from the ports. Many were twice as far. The German prisoners stared out those windows hour after hour, day after day, and saw something impossible. America was not destroyed. There were no bombed cities, no rubble, no ruins. The towns they passed through had intact buildings, functioning businesses, people going about their daily lives as if there was no war at all. Children played in schoolyards. Farmers worked their fields. Housewives shopped at grocery stores with shelves full of goods. Some prisoners refused to believe what they were seeing. They insisted the Americans were driving the trains in circles to make the country appear larger than it actually was. They convinced themselves that the routes were deliberately chosen to avoid devastated areas that surely existed. The Luftwaffe must have bombed something. Their leaders had told them the war was going well, but the trains kept rolling and the landscape kept coming. Mile after mile of farmland, fields of wheat stretching to the horizon like golden oceans, cattle grazing on hillsides by the thousands, tractors working the soil, each one doing the work of dozens of men and horses, small towns with main streets full of shops passed by the windows, hardware stores, grocery stores, clothing stores, restaurants, all of them open, all of them doing business. The windows displayed goods that had vanished from German shops years ago. Cities appeared with factories producing not weapons but consumer goods. Automobile plants, furniture factories, appliance manufacturers. The smokestacks poured out evidence of an economy that could make war and still make refrigerators at the same time. Movie theaters had lines of people waiting to get in. Americans had the leisure time and the money to watch entertainment while their country fought a global war. The prisoners saw this and tried to reconcile it with what they had been told about American sacrifice and struggle. Automobiles filled the roads, real civilian automobiles driving on paved highways that stretched in every direction. In Germany, civilian gasoline had been rationed almost out of existence. Private cars sat on blocks in garages, their tires donated to the war effort, their fuel long since consumed. Here, Americans drove wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Many veterans of the Afrika Korps later described watching the American heartland pass their windows. They saw more tractors in 1 hour than existed in entire provinces back in Germany. They saw grain elevators the size of buildings. They saw trucks loaded with produce heading in every direction. And they understood, in those moments, that everything Nazi propaganda had claimed about America was a lie. The prisoners who arrived in Mississippi in August of 1943 described similar journeys. They had expected a slow freight train to carry them to their destination. Instead, they boarded a sleek, comfortable passenger train. 2 days later, they arrived at Camp Clinton outside Jackson, still unable to fully comprehend what they had witnessed through the windows. The camps themselves delivered the final blow to German morale. The United States military, bound by the Geneva Convention of 1929, was required to provide prisoners of war with the same quality of food, housing, and medical care given to its own soldiers. American commanders took this requirement seriously, partly out of genuine humanitarian concern and partly in hopes that good treatment of German prisoners would encourage Germany to treat American POWs well in return. More than 500 camps were constructed across the country. Some were massive installations holding thousands of prisoners. Others were small satellite camps housing a few dozen men who worked on nearby farms. The government guidelines mandated placing the compounds away from urban and industrial areas for security purposes, in regions with mild climate to minimize construction costs, and at sites where prisoners could help alleviate anticipated farm labor shortages. Texas received the largest share of prisoners. Nearly 80,000 German POWs spent time in the Lone Star State across 70 different camps. The Geneva Convention recommended that prisoners be housed in climates similar to where they had been captured, and the hot, dry climate of Texas was the closest. American equivalent to Tunisia. The result was that German prisoners in America lived better than many American civilians, and far better than they had lived as soldiers of the Wehrmacht. The camps consisted of wooden barracks similar to those housing American troops. Prisoners slept in real beds with mattresses and clean sheets. They had access to showers with hot water. They received 3 meals a day prepared by German cooks using ingredients provided by the United States Army. A typical breakfast included cereal, toast, jam, coffee with real milk and sugar. Lunch might be roast pork with potato salad and vegetables. Dinner could include meatloaf, scrambled eggs, bread, and more coffee. Beer could be purchased in the canteen. Ice cream was available for those with money to buy it. Some prisoners had not eaten this well in years. Many came from poor families in Germany who had endured years of rationing even before the war. The idea that they could eat meat every day, that they could have coffee without rationing, that they could purchase candy and ice cream and Coca-Cola from camp canteens seemed impossible. It seemed like a dream from which they would soon wake. One former prisoner named Gunter Grawe later described a moment at Fort Lewis in Washington state in 1944. He stood in front of the camp store trying to decide what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream he had been able to buy in Germany was years earlier. Coca-Cola he had never tasted. He decided to take both, and he realized in that moment how extraordinarily lucky he was to have been captured by the Americans rather than the Soviets. The camps offered more than food. Prisoners had access to sports facilities where they played soccer, volleyball, horseshoes, and other games. They could participate in theatrical productions and musical performances. They could take educational courses, including English language classes. They could read books from camp. Libraries. They could receive and send mail to their families in Germany. They could worship in religious services led by chaplains. The daily routine at a camp in California tells the story. Prisoners woke at 6:30, breakfast at 7. Work began at 7:30, usually at fruit orchards around the county. The quota was 36 boxes of oranges per prisoner. At noon, lunch was served in the field. Prisoners who had already filled their quotas returned to camp early. The others continued until the work was done, then dinner, then recreation, then sleep. The cycle repeated. American civilians who lived near the camps sometimes complained that prisoners were being treated too well. They called the facilities Fritz Ritz, a sarcastic reference to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Newspaper editorials questioned why enemy soldiers were eating meat while American families dealt with rationing. Politicians received angry letters demanding harsher treatment. Some Americans who had sons fighting overseas found it difficult to accept that the enemy was being fed and housed in comfort. But the treatment continued, and it had an effect that no one fully anticipated. The prisoners had time to think. They had time to observe. They had time to compare what they were living through in America with what they knew about life in Germany. They noticed that American guards did not beat them, that American officers spoke to them with a certain baseline respect, that American civilians, while sometimes hostile, did not form mobs or demand executions. They noticed the legal procedures, the rules, the systems that governed their captivity. They noticed that there was a process for complaints, that the Red Cross conducted inspections, that their rights as prisoners were actually protected. The contrast with what they knew about German treatment of prisoners was stark. They knew about the camps in the East. They knew about the conditions that Soviet prisoners endured. They knew, even if they did not admit it, that Germany would never have treated American prisoners this way. Some of the most committed Nazis among the prisoners dismissed all of this as weakness. They maintained their ideology behind the barbed wire, formed secret hierarchies within the camps, and punished fellow prisoners who showed sympathy for their captors. The violence within the camps was real and sometimes deadly. In October of 1943, at a POW camp in the remote Kansas cornfields, a secret Nazi hierarchy forced a fellow prisoner named Felix Tropschur to hang himself for writing in his diary that he feared Nazism would ruin Germany. A few weeks later, a German prisoner named Johannes Kunze at a camp in Oklahoma was beaten to death by approximately 200 prisoners for allegedly writing a note to the Americans suggesting bombing targets in Germany. In Texas, a German-American prisoner named Hugo Kraus was fatally beaten for reporting Nazi activity. In Arizona, 7 U-boat crewmen hanged a fellow submariner named Werner Drexler, who had become an informant for American intelligence. In Arkansas, a prisoner named Hans Geller was killed for working harder than required. In South Carolina, a prisoner named Horst Gunter was strangled over rumors he favored the Americans. The American authorities struggled to contain this violence. They separated known Nazi loyalists from other prisoners when possible, sending the most fanatical to a special camp in Alva, Oklahoma. They monitored prisoner activities and tried to identify the secret organizations operating within the barbed wire. But the camps were largely self-governing, with German officers and NCOs maintaining discipline among their own men. The Americans could not see everything. 14 German prisoners were ultimately executed at Fort Leavenworth for these murders. But despite the internal violence, many prisoners began to question everything they had believed. The industrial capacity of the United States was impossible to hide. Prisoners who worked on farms saw the mechanization of American agriculture. They saw combines and tractors and trucks that made German farming methods look primitive. They saw the scale of American farming operations, with individual farms larger than entire villages back home. Prisoners who had grown up on farms in Germany described their shock at watching American agriculture in operation. Many had seen peasants working with hand tools and draft animals all their lives. Now they watched single machines harvest more grain in an hour than entire villages could harvest in a week. They wrote in letters home that it was like watching magic, like watching the future. Prisoners who worked in factories saw production lines churning out goods at speeds that defied comprehension. The assembly line techniques that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier had been refined and applied to every conceivable product. Tanks rolled off production lines like automobiles. Aircraft components were stamped out by the thousands. Ammunition was produced by the trainload. Prisoners who were transported across the country saw the infrastructure, the highways, the rail networks, the ports, the sheer scale of American capability. They saw bridges and tunnels and roads that had been built in peacetime. They saw construction crews building new facilities even as the war raged. They saw a nation that was not merely fighting a war but growing stronger while it fought. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could contradict. When Adolf Hitler was told in 1940 that President Franklin Roosevelt had called for the production of 50,000 aircraft, his advisers dismissed it as propaganda. American military aircraft production in 1939 had been less than 3,000 planes per year. The idea that they could multiply their output more than 15 times seemed like fantasy. It was not fantasy. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 planes annually. Not 50,000. 100,000. The United States built more aircraft in 1944 alone than Japan built during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. By the end of the conflict, American factories had produced over 300,000 planes. Consider what that means. At the peak of production, American factories were building more than 8,000 aircraft every month. That was nearly 300 planes per day, more than 12 planes per hour. One new aircraft rolling off the assembly lines every 5 minutes, around the clock, month after month. Tank production showed the same pattern. In 1940, American factories produced 365 tanks. By 1943, That number had risen to nearly 29,000 tanks as part of over 37,000 armoured fighting vehicles. Germany, for all its vaunted industrial capacity, never came close to matching these numbers. The shipyards demonstrated American industrial power most dramatically of all. When war began, German naval planners calculated that their U-boat fleet could sink Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. Admiral Karl Donitz built his entire strategy around this calculation. Sink enough tonnage, starve Britain into submission, and the Americans would have no way to project power across the Atlantic. The German admirals had studied American shipbuilding capacity. They had estimated production rates based on peacetime performance. They had concluded, with mathematical precision, that American shipyards could not possibly build ships fast enough to replace the losses their submarines would inflict. They were catastrophically wrong. American shipyards, particularly those run by industrialist Henry Kaiser, revolutionized shipbuilding through assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. Before the war, shipbuilders expected to take close to 6 months from laying a keel to launching a ship. The standard Liberty ship had originally taken around 230 days to build. Some shipyards took even longer. The process was slow, methodical, and unchanged in its essentials from the 19th century. Henry Kaiser looked at shipbuilding and saw inefficiency everywhere. He had built dams and roads and bridges. He understood mass production. He understood logistics. He looked at traditional shipyards and asked a simple question: why are we doing it this way? Kaiser changed everything. He instituted modular construction, building ship sections separately in different parts of the yard and then welding them together on the ways. He replaced riveting with welding, which was faster and required less skilled labor. A riveter needed months of training. A welder could be productive in weeks. He recruited workers from across the United States, including women and minorities who had never worked in shipyards before. He provided daycare centers for working mothers and health insurance for all employees. He created what would later become Kaiser Permanente, the healthcare organization that still bears his name. He turned shipbuilding into something closer to automobile manufacturing. Ships came off the line the way cars came off the line at Ford. Standardized, efficient, fast. The results were staggering. Kaiser reduced construction time to 45 days on average. Then his yards began competing against each other to set new records. In September of 1942, the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation built the SS Joseph N. Teal in just 10 days. 2 months later, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard built the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. 4 days to build a ship. America launched more vessels in 1941 than Japan did during the entire war. By autumn of 1943, American shipyards had replaced every ton of Allied shipping lost since 1939. The U-boat threat that was supposed to starve Britain into submission had been overcome by sheer industrial output. At the peak of American war production in late 1943 and early 1944, the United States was manufacturing almost as many munitions as all of its allies and enemies combined. By the end of the war, more than half of all industrial production in the world would take place in the United States. German prisoners saw evidence of this capacity everywhere they looked. They saw it in the endless trains carrying materiel to the ports. They saw it in the new construction at military bases. They saw it in the newspapers and magazines available in camp libraries, which documented American production achievements with pride. They saw it in the simple fact that America could fight a two-front war across 2 oceans, while simultaneously feeding and housing 400,000 enemy prisoners in relative comfort. The psychological impact on the prisoners was profound. Many German soldiers had genuinely believed they were winning the war. Nazi propaganda had emphasized German victories while downplaying defeats. The surrender in North Africa was explained as a strategic withdrawal, a temporary setback that would soon be reversed. The prisoners expected to be liberated within months as German forces pushed the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they watched through barbed wire as America grew stronger. They heard about the invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. They heard about the Italian surrender in September. They heard about the bombing campaigns over Germany that their leaders had assured them were impossible. They heard about the Allied landings at Normandy in June of 1944. They watched American confidence grow as German territory shrank. And they remembered what their leaders had told them about America, the weak Americans, the soft Americans, the Americans who could never match German industrial might or German military discipline. Those leaders had been wrong about everything. The work programs brought prisoners into direct contact with ordinary Americans in ways that deepened this realization. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work in non-military jobs if they were paid for their labor. With millions of American men serving overseas, the country faced severe labor shortages, particularly in agriculture. The shortage was acute. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to fill factory jobs, but agricultural work remained backbreaking physical labor that required strong hands. The harvest of 1943 threatened to rot in the fields for lack of workers. German prisoners provided the solution. German prisoners became farm workers across the American South and Midwest. In Louisiana, they harvested sugarcane that would have rotted in the fields without their labor. In Maine, they picked potatoes. They picked cotton in Mississippi, worked sugar beet fields in Nebraska and Colorado, harvested wheat in Kansas. They picked peaches in Georgia, oranges in California, and apples in Washington. They rolled cigarettes in tobacco factories and cut timber in forests. They worked in rock quarries and as plumbers, carpenters, and painters. The government estimated that prisoner labor cost 50 to 75% of normal free labor. While language differences and the risk of escape were disadvantages, prisoner workers were available immediately on demand and in the exact numbers needed. Their work was reliable and often of higher quality than what could be obtained elsewhere. The prisoners needed the work to fill their days, and the Americans needed the labor to feed their nation. Local citizens often appreciated their contributions far more than anyone expected. Farmers across the South described the German POWs in surprisingly warm terms. Employers found them cooperative, well-mannered, and good-natured. Many praised them as among the best workers they had ever seen. An army officer in Peabody, Kansas, had to caution local farm wives against further incidents of baking cookies for the prisoners and mending their clothes. The fraternization was becoming too friendly for military comfort. The prisoners were paid 80 cents per day in scrip that they could spend at camp canteens. It was not much by American standards, but for men who had owned nothing as soldiers, it provided a taste of the consumer abundance that surrounded them. Some prisoners formed genuine friendships with the Americans they worked alongside. They were invited into homes for meals. They attended church services with local families. They played with American children who found the foreign soldiers fascinating rather than frightening. When Christmas came, some prisoners were invited to holiday dinners by the families they had worked for throughout the year. These intimate gatherings, where enemy soldiers sat at American tables and sometimes joined in singing Christmas carols, defied everything the war was supposed to mean. These interactions confused many prisoners deeply. They had been taught that Americans were enemies, that the war was a struggle between civilizations, that there could be no common ground. Instead, they found ordinary people who wanted the war to end, who missed their own sons fighting overseas, who could not see the young Germans as monsters. Not all encounters were friendly. Some Americans maintained hostility toward the prisoners throughout the war. There were communities that refused to allow German workers anywhere near their farms. There were incidents of guards abusing prisoners, though these were relatively rare and often resulted in discipline. There was also a profound irony that African American observers noted at the time. German prisoners, because they were white, were sometimes accorded privileges denied to black Americans. Prisoners could eat in. restaurants that were segregated against black customers. They could sit in sections of buses and trains reserved for white passengers. The contrast between how America treated enemy soldiers and how it treated its own citizens was not lost on anyone paying attention. But for most German prisoners, the overwhelming reality was one of cognitive dissonance. Everything they saw contradicted everything they had been told. The enemy was supposed to be weak, but the enemy was strong. The enemy was supposed to be barbaric, but the enemy treated them humanely. The enemy was supposed to be losing, but the enemy was winning. Of the more than 400,000 German prisoners held in the United States during the war, only 2,222 attempted to escape. That was less than 1%. Most who tried were quickly recaptured within a day or two. The vast distances, the unfamiliar landscape, and the difficulty of blending into American society made escape nearly impossible. The government could not account for 7 prisoners when they were repatriated. Most were eventually found. One, Georg Gartner, escaped from a camp in New Mexico in September of 1945 to avoid being returned to Silesia, which was now occupied by the Soviet Union. He assumed a new identity and lived quietly in California, Colorado, and Hawaii for 40 years before coming forward in 1985 on national television. After years of bureaucratic delays, he finally became a naturalized American citizen in 2009, just 3 years before his death. When Germany finally surrendered in May of 1945, many prisoners felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the fighting was over, grief for their country, fear about what awaited them back home, and for some, a kind of terrible vindication. They had understood for months, even years, that Germany could not win. The evidence had been right in front of their faces every day. Some prisoners wept when they heard the news. Others celebrated. The Nazi hardliners among them remained defiant, insisting that the surrender was a betrayal, that Germany could have won if only the leadership had been stronger, but most simply felt a profound exhaustion and a desperate hope that they would finally be allowed to go home. The news of the concentration camps had already begun to filter through. American newspapers carried stories of liberation at Buchenwald, at Dachau, at Bergen-Belsen. The images were appearing in magazines available in camp libraries. Some prisoners refused to believe what they were seeing. Others claimed ignorance. Still others fell silent, unable to reconcile the Germany they had fought for with the horrors being revealed. The war's end did not bring immediate freedom. The Geneva Convention required rapid repatriation of prisoners, but logistical realities made this impossible. Ships that had brought prisoners to America were now needed to transport American soldiers home from Europe and the Pacific. The massive operation of moving 400,000 men back across the Atlantic could not happen overnight. The prisoners continued working through the summer and fall of 1945, helping with harvests that America still desperately needed. Repatriation began in earnest in early 1946 and continued throughout the year. Before they left, the prisoners were required to watch documentary footage of Nazi concentration camps. American authorities wanted them to see the full reality of what their country had done. Many prisoners claimed they had no knowledge of the Holocaust. Some were genuinely shocked. Others had known more than they admitted. But all of them had to confront the images of death camps and mass graves before they were allowed to go home. The Germany they returned to was unrecognizable. Cities that had been intact when they left were now rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne, countless other cities had been bombed into ruins. Families had been scattered or killed. Food was scarce. Jobs were non-existent. The infrastructure had collapsed. The nation was occupied by foreign armies. The contrast with the abundance they had known in America was stark and bitter. Many prisoners found it difficult to readjust. They had spent years in a kind of suspended animation, well-fed and relatively comfortable while their homeland was destroyed. They returned to devastation and judgment from those who had suffered while they had not. Some were accused of having had it easy while their families starved under the bombs. but their time in captivity changed them in ways that mattered for decades to come. After repatriation, approximately 5,000 German former prisoners emigrated back to the United States. They had seen something during their years behind American barbed wire that they wanted to be part of. They became American citizens, raised American families, built American lives. Thousands of others returned to visit the places where they had been held. They renewed friendships with the farmers who had employed them, the families who had fed them, the guards who had watched over them. Some maintained correspondence with American contacts for decades. They sent food and clothing to the Americans during the post-war shortages when roles were briefly reversed. One former prisoner named Hans Wechmar was held at Fort Robinson in Nebraska. After the war, he returned to the United States and became a physician in Maine. He spent the rest of his life in the country that had once been his enemy. In interviews conducted decades later, he described his treatment as excellent. The food was excellent. The clothing was adequate. Life behind barbed wire had been, as one prisoner called it, a golden cage. Another former prisoner, Gunter Grawe, the young man who had stood before the camp store deciding between ice cream and Coca-Cola, returned to the site of his captivity at Joint Base Lewis-McChord in 2017 at the age of 91. He rode his bicycle from the gate to the site of his former barracks. He wanted to say thank you to America for the treatment he had received. Many former prisoners later reflected that no formal re-education program had been necessary in the camps. They had become convinced Democrats simply through their treatment. They had seen democracy in action, not in speeches or pamphlets, but in the daily reality of how a free society operated. That revelation was worth more than any propaganda. The German prisoners who returned home carried those lessons with them. As Germany rebuilt in the post-war years, many of them became advocates for democratic institutions, for reconciliation with former enemies, for the kind of society they had glimpsed behind American barbed wire. They told their families what they had witnessed. They told their children about the wheat fields and the factories and the towns without rubble. They told their grandchildren about ice cream and Coca-Cola and farmers who baked cookies for enemy soldiers. They became, in a sense, ambassadors for an America that many Germans had never imagined could exist. Their transformation proved particularly important in the context of the Cold War that followed. When the Western Allies needed to rebuild West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, they found a population that included hundreds of thousands of men who had seen American abundance firsthand. These men knew that capitalism could produce prosperity. They knew that democracy could function. They had lived it. One former prisoner, Baron Rudiger von Wechmar, who had been held at Camp Trinidad in Colorado, went on to serve as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. In 1980, he was elected president of the UN General Assembly. He had learned journalism through a correspondence course from the University of Minnesota while behind barbed wire. Others became business. Leaders, teachers, politicians, clergy members, and civic leaders. They shaped a new Germany that looked west rather than east, that embraced democratic values rather than authoritarian ones, that became one of America's closest allies. 860 German prisoners of war died during their captivity in the United States. They are buried in 43 sites across the country. Their graves are often tended by local German heritage organizations and American veterans groups alike. Small markers in places like Fort Leavenworth and Fort Riley and dozens of other locations remember young men who crossed an ocean to fight and never went home. Every year on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, some of these graves receive flowers and small German flags. Local communities that once feared the arrival of enemy soldiers now tend their resting places with a strange mixture of sorrow and respect. The enemies of long ago have become neighbors in death. The POW camps themselves have mostly vanished. The wooden barracks were temporary structures torn down after the war or converted to other uses. But traces remain. At Fort Robinson in Nebraska, a few brown buildings still stand where thousands of Afrika Korps veterans once lived. In Mississippi, historical markers note where Camp Clinton once housed German generals. In Alabama, the Aliceville Museum preserves the memory of the camp that once swelled the town's population. The story of German POWs in America has largely faded from memory. It does not fit neatly into the narratives we prefer about World War II. It complicates our understanding of enemies and allies, of captivity and freedom, of what it means to win a war. But the German prisoners understood something that we sometimes forget. Wars are not won only on battlefields. They are won in factories and farms, in shipyards and laboratories, in the accumulated productive capacity of entire societies. Germany had excellent soldiers, brilliant generals, and advanced weapons. But Germany did not have endless wheat fields or inexhaustible oil reserves or factories that could produce a ship every 4 days. The prisoners who stared out those Pullman car windows saw the truth that their leaders had hidden from them. They saw a nation that could absorb the shock of Pearl Harbor and respond by becoming the most productive economy in human history. They saw a nation that could fight across 2 oceans while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded anything in the Reich. They saw a nation that could treat its enemies with decency, even while destroying their armies. And they understood, in those long train rides across an impossible abundance, that they had never had a chance. This story matters because it reminds us that the outcome of World War II was not inevitable. It was produced by specific choices, specific investments, specific sacrifices. The factories that built those Liberty ships were constructed by workers who chose to show up every day. The farms that fed both armies were tended by families who refused to let their country down. The policies that treated prisoners humanely reflected values that Americans chose to uphold even in the midst of total war. The German prisoners absorbed all of this. They returned home and shared these truths with their children and grandchildren. They helped build a new Germany that became an ally rather than an enemy. They remembered, even when others forgot. Many Americans distinguished between the Nazi government and the German people themselves. That distinction shaped policy. It influenced how prisoners were treated. It guided how Germany was rebuilt after the war. It shaped the world we live in today. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below, telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans across continents, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.